Hi, I'm Mike Shea from SlyFlourish.com, and I'm the author of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. This is the 7th in an 8-part video series in which I look at each of the 8 steps of game preparation described in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. This one's going to focus on Step 7, Choosing Relevant Monsters. You can see the chapter over here on the left. If you get nothing else out of this video, the number one thing I would recommend to you is that it is worth your time to read the monster manual. Go pick it up, sit on the couch, and go through it from A to Z. Read all of the monsters. You don't have to spend a lot of time kind of digging into the stat blocks of every particular monster. It's generally nice to know roughly how powerful a monster is over another. But generally speaking, you want to look at the text. You want to understand the lore of the monsters that you're going to run. We have a lot of ideas about monsters in our head. We know a lot about mythology. We've all seen Lord of the Rings, but it can really help to understand the monsters in the context of the game that we're playing, in this case, Dungeons & Dragons. So take the time to read the monster manual. It is worth it. Even though we talk about lazy dungeon mastering, this is a whole book based on lazy dungeon mastering. The reality is it is worth your time. It is very valuable to absorb as much as you can from the monster manual. Really let it seep in, because that is going to make it easier to improvise when you're running a game. You're going to get a lot of really good story ideas. And when you're doing all of the rest of this prep, a lot of it is you understanding, like, what are the difference between demons and devils, or which creatures like to hang out with hags. These are all things that you can sort of put together in your head and sort of know. And when you have that in your brain, it's a lot easier to do the rest. So it's a lot of upfront work, but it's worth it. So the other one is to have a loose gauge of challenge rating. A lot of people are fixated on balance, on encounter balance, making sure we get the right numbers and power of monsters to face the characters that we've got. The reality is balance is completely hosed up. So we don't need to worry about that as much. We want to know if an encounter is going to be deadly or not. We want to have a general gauge of, like, did I completely blow this encounter away? Is it going to be too hard? Too easy isn't a problem. It just means the characters are going to kick their ass, and that's fine. It's a lot easier to deal with encounters where the players beat the hell out of some monsters you thought might be hard. The other direction, though, can be a little trickier. I have another book called The Lazy DM's Workbook, and that has a very brief chart that you can see over here on the left of what kind of monster challenge ratings equate to what number of characters at a given level. And it's generally all based on, you look at the challenge rating of a monster, divide it by some number, then usually the number, the level of the characters, and it tells you how many monsters per character. So it looks a little complicated. It's actually not that bad once you have it in mind. The thing is that challenge rating is very different for level 1 characters. It's also very different for tier 1 characters, which are level 1 to 4. And then it all bets are off when you get to level 5 and above. The character power that comes to the table at higher levels is so high that it's even hard to put a chart around it. You can download a summary sheet, which I will include in the notes below. That includes, this is a quick reference sheet for many things for 5th edition D&D, and it has some quick encounter building guidelines over here in the lower left that include everything that's in the workbook. This is available for free down in the show notes. You can download it there. So having a general idea of what a encounter looks like can help you, but you tend not to need to worry about that too much. So just have a loose gauge in your head of what kind of challenge rating is going to be deadly for certain characters. Be prepared to improvise encounters. So when we're talking about kind of choosing monsters, what we want to do is list out what monsters we think are going to be relevant to the situation that's going on. If they're going into the sewers, what are the kinds of monsters that they would run into in the sewers? If they're going down into the Underdark, what kind of monsters might they face there? If they're going into a vampire's castle, what kind of monsters might they face there? We only have to write down their names. We can just go look them up in the monster book. I'm a big fan of bringing your monster manual with you and using it, but now you can also look them up on things like D&D Beyond and elsewhere. But we don't have to. I think a lot of DMs like to snapshot stat blocks and put it into OneNote and things like that. That's fine. If it works for you, it's great. But it is a little bit of extra work. And it also means you're less likely to go ahead and throw those monsters out and pick some new ones if the situation arises at the game. So I'm a bigger fan of just bringing your monster book with you and then keeping a loose list of what monsters you think might show up and then grab them when you need them. So, and the reality is during the game, things are going to switch and we want to be able to improvise the combat encounters that are going to show up. So maybe they run into some hobgoblins, maybe not. Maybe the hobgoblins are gone and they left an ogre, to sit for them. So we want to make sure that we are able to sort of improvise the encounters. We don't necessarily have to have these perfectly balanced blocks of encounters that the characters are going to fight from scene to scene. So, and in our prep, we just really write the monster names down. A special circumstance where we do want to spend the time is on boss fights. I actually don't try to do a lot of boss fights anymore. And part of the reason is that they're really hard to do, but they matter. So they matter enough that it's worth our time to really study how a boss is going to act in a fight. What are they going to do? How do we have our hands on dials that we can turn during the fight to either increase or decrease the difficulty depending on how it's going? An example is hit points. We can fudge the hit points during a fight. I know this is sacrilege to a lot of DMs, but the truth is a lot of DMs do this. We should know, like, what's the average hit points of this guy and what's the maximum hit points. And if things are going really poorly for them and we think it kind of is lame, we can just turn that dial a little to the left and make it a little harder. Same with number of attacks, same with more monsters showing up. There's ways that we can make sure that a boss fight really feels like an interesting and detailed fight that's both threatening but not overpowering. So boss fights are worth trying out, and I offer some more advice on this, like running test fights. Do you have an opportunity to throw a boss up against the characters and see how it works out? Either one way or the other. Try out a boss and see, did they get killed? Maybe it was a dream sequence, and it's okay if the characters got killed because they really didn't die. Maybe like a vampire. If a vampire attacks the characters, the vampire might just want to test them out and see how they do. And if the vampire kicks their ass, he's like, okay, I'm not worried about these guys, and leaves. If he dies, he goes back to his coffin, and now he's like, man, I better go work out and get some friends, right? So we can test it out with a fight ahead of time. Dream sequences are great ways to test out monsters. Having a similar monster to the boss that fights the characters but isn't as important as the boss is another way. And then bosses that have some way to restore themselves, either a simulacrum. I had a high-powered sorcerer dragon that had a simulacrum that attacked, and that way when the simulacrum died, it meant that the actual dragon was still alive and knew, so that's what it's like. So there's lots of little tricks to testing boss fights. What else? So yeah, you want to understand what those dials are for boss fights in particular. But again, generally, most of the time, we don't have to worry about it too much. And instead, what we do is we just say, what are the monsters that make sense for the next game that I'm going to run? What are the monsters that make sense for that context? And just list them out. And go and give them a read in the monster manual just so you have the lore of the monster in your head. So that's pretty much it for this step. Again, like the whole rest of this, we kind of keep it loose and we help ourselves to improvise during the game. So we're not spending a lot of time building perfectly balanced combat encounters. Instead, we're just saying, what are the monsters that make sense? Let's list those out. Let's take a look at them. And then let's be prepared to run them during the game. So I hope this video was useful. This is the second to last video in this series. So you'll see one more video to go talking about treasure. And you can see all 8 steps once the next video is done on YouTube. To see all 8 steps and descriptions of how all the 8 steps for Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master work out. So I hope this is useful. Thank you very much for your time, and I have a great game.